we'll need to see if the original language clears up the ambiguity that might have arisen through this translation. And so now going back to they go back and they deal with the Greek, and it has Greek wording there anyways. Vincent, in his word studies, translates this as husband of one wife. Lenski translated it as a one wife's husband. William Mounce says the word is a one woman man. Michael Morris says, or translated as a husband of but one wife, or literally one woman's man. And so what we see again is the original language still does not really give us any answers to our questions. And it leaves us with the same ambiguities of what really are the answers. And so I took bits and pieces out of the article rather than doing the whole article. But we'll deal with some of the things here. First of all, bishop must be. We talked about that at the very beginning. He must be. This is present tense. At the time that he is serving, these are things that he must be. And it says the qualification in 1 Timothy 3:2 is that a bishop must be in the present tense. The Greek word combined means must be for each one of the qualities, and that is, that's in elder's wife. For instance, it would be no good for an elder to have one time have been hospitable, but no longer be hospitable. Nor would it behoove the congregation to have an elder who in the past was able to teach, but currently is not able to teach. And then it goes on to talk about the fact of husband of one wife, he must be. If he no longer has a wife, his wife has died, is he husband of one wife? And, he must be, it must have. And so that I'm saying you can go back and if you want to read the whole article. And then it goes on, only one wife, his whole life. This is the question anyways. We have established then that the candidate for eldership must be a man who literally is a husband of one wife. And there's a lot that went in between here. Our work is not done, however, because questions still remain concerning the qualification. Does the husband of one wife mean that the candidate must currently be married to only one wife that he has been married to his entire life? If his wife dies and he remains single, is he still then the husband of one wife, since he is only married to one woman in his life? Or if his wife dies and he remarries and is no longer husband of one wife, no longer the husband of one wife, since he has now been married twice to two different women? And then he goes on. First, let's state that the most ideal situation is the one in which a man has been married to one woman for his whole life, and they still are together during the time of his eldership. This situation would meet every criterion that challenges the phrase husband of one wife. But, of course, stating the ideal does not exclude other possibilities that might be less than ideal and are still viable. Let's then deal with the situation in which a man has been married, his spouse dies, and he is currently in his second marriage. Is this man a candidate for eldership? He goes on to talk about, I'll come back after we get through. He goes on to talk about the different passages where when wife dies, in Romans the 7th chapter and 1 Corinthians 7th chapter, when a wife dies or a husband or wife dies, they're free from that bond. And then he says, thus a person who is married to a wife on earth, when she dies, is no longer married to that person. While she was his wife in the past, she cannot rightly be called his wife now, since covenant marriage is over at the point of death of the spouse. Then he goes on to summarize by saying, surely no one seriously believes that if a man's wife dies, that he is still bound to her in marriage. Thus, if he marries a second time, he still has only one wife. That is, he is truly still the husband of one wife. McGarvey put it this way: it may be well to add that one living wife is clearly meant, and that there is no allusion to the number there, no allusion to the number of deceased wives a man has. If his wife is dead, he is no longer her husband. And then the next question that's asked that he is, and that was some were asking last week too, is can a man who has been divorced and remarried be an elder? And it says if a man loses his spouse to death and remarries, can he be considered for eldership? And the natural question is, what about the man who is divorced and remarried? The phrase, the husband of one wife, does not mean having been married only once in his life. That would seem to admit that the possibility was that a man who has been divorced and is remarried to one wife is eligible. Before delving into this, let's restate the ideal. The perfect situation is one man, or a man who is married to one time to the same woman and is living together with her while he is serving as an elder. There is possibly, however, that of a divorced man who is remarried and may, in this question anyways, may he be an elder. When we look at the teachings of Jesus in the Bible, we see that God hates divorce, Malachi, the 2nd chapter, verse 6, and that in every divorce, in every divorce, sin and selfishness on someone's part lies at the heart of the broken marriage. When the Pharisees questioned Jesus about divorce, he explained to them from the beginning of the human race, God instituted marriage to be between one man and one woman for life. This is Matthew 19. In the course of this discussion, Jesus noted that Jesus noted there's only one possible exception in which a person can divorce his wife lawfully in the sight of God. Jesus said, and I say to you, whosoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That's Matthew 19:9. The sole exception that Jesus gave for dissolving a marriage in the eyes of God, if a person's spouse has been if a person's spouse has sexual intercourse with another besides his or her spouse. Jesus' statement implies that if a man divorces his wife for sexual immorality and he marries another person, he does not commit adultery by remarrying the second person. And if any man can be married to a second wife because he has divorced his first wife due to sexual infidelity and not be considered by God to have committed adultery, then it follows that God must, at least in the innocent party's case, view the first marriage as dissolved and the covenant broken. Therefore, it could be still the case of a man who has divorced his wife because of sexual immorality or sexual infidelity and marries another woman, could be considered the husband of one wife. It would appear logical that a person's condition upon the death of his wife or due to divorce because of marital infidelity will be the same as a subsequent marriage, which would not disqualify him from being the husband of one wife. And then it goes on, if divorce is based on adultery, if divorce on the basis of adultery is legal and dissolves the marriage so that the one divorced can marry another, is the one remarrying considered now to be the husband of one wife? It seems evident that the legality of such a remarried person is that he is the husband of one wife. Yeah, husband of one. I was making sure I read that right. Husband of one wife. He is not considered to have two wives. If this is true, then technically he meets the requirements of the language of 1 Timothy and Titus. Then he comes to this conclusion. Paul states that an elder must be the husband of one wife. There are some aspects of this statement that are clearer than others. It can be determined that the phrase necessarily means that only men are to be considered for the office. The exclusion of women from the office of eldership does not imply that men are more valuable than women. It simply accords that with the biblical teaching that men and women have different roles and not different status as Christians. In addition, the phrase a husband of one wife is in the present tense statement that implies that a man should be currently married to one woman. The candidate for eldership, about whom there is no question as it pertains to this qualification, is a man who is currently married to only one woman, and that or the same wife that he's been married to, and he stayed married to her throughout his eldership. A close examination of the qualifications, however, would seem to indicate that a man who is remarried after the death of a spouse or who is remarried after the divorce because of his wife's sexual infidelity is technically still viewed as a husband of one wife. And I might go on to, there's a little bit more that they discussed along that line of in individual congregations. The congregations actually are ultimately up to whether or not they want to accept somebody that's been divorced, let's say, or somebody that's their husband's died, their wife's died and they've remarried. Some congregations see nothing wrong with it, other congregations do. And does that mean that the man cannot serve in, maybe not as an elder, but cannot serve in every other way? And I like the way that he put it in the article. They put it in the article. Who are probably two of the people in the New Testament that you think of that are probably the most spiritual? Paul and Barnabas. Neither one of them could be an elder because they were not married. But we do have another one of the apostles who did call himself an elder. In 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, verse 4, I think it is, Peter called himself a fellow elder with him. What's the difference? We know Peter was married. He was a husband of one wife. And so I wanted to throw this out. I know it's a little more detailed. There's a lot of questions last week that people asked afterwards. And the article is a lot bigger than what I had, a lot more. And I looked at some other articles, but I thought that one was one of the best ones. So just kind of throw it out. Is there any other questions before we go on to the next section? Does this help a little bit? Okay, way back.
So Richard, if I heard that right, you're saying that if a person divorces because a spouse for sexual immorality, they're not eligible for an elder?
No, that they are if they're divorced. The way the article reads, and it has merit. They are if they're divorced for sexual immorality, like the wife is committed sexual immorality, then that marriage relationship is broken.
Yeah.
Jesus says if that man remarries, he does not commit adultery, and so that would be considered a new covenant relationship, a single. He's a husband of one wife. He's not the husband of two wives. Now, if his wife was she burned the toast and he divorced her, then he'd have two wives in a sense. But that, and what I think, again, get back to the ideal, and he tried to really stress this in the article. The ideal is one man who has the same wife throughout his life and even throughout his eldership. There's no question about that. Now, what about the person whose husband or whose wife died or who has had a divorce? Okay.
I see a problem with that because if a man commits adultery, I guess he's fine. It's only when the woman commits adultery.
No, and actually in Matthew, or is it Mark? One of the other translations, he reverses it also, where even if the husband commits adultery, he's guilty of sin. And but even when, and I guess this comes back, it's totally different. But even when adultery is committed, that can be reconciled. There can be forgiveness.
Reconciliation is preferred.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that would be God's preferred route. Yeah. Okay, Scott, and then.
That's rich.
Rich.
I'm with Joseph. That article seemed kind of confusing. Paul lays it out the most concisely as can be said in 1 Corinthians 7:39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord.
Yeah,
Yet in my judgment, she's happier if she remains as she is.
yeah. And that was, that's a part of it that I left out of the article. He did deal with the Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. But that the bond is broken, okay?
If I was the CEO of a corporation and I had the responsibility of hiring employees and I didn't use good judgment in doing that, I would have the right to fire a poor performing employee, but it showed that I did not use good judgment in hiring. So part of entering into marriage is using good judgment, hiring your spouse. Part of being a good leader of the household is keeping control of your family. Now, you can be a husband in a marriage and you can be an innocent party, meaning you were not involved in an inappropriate relationship, but that doesn't mean you were entirely innocent in not running your household or choosing your mate properly. And I think the words "God hates divorce" is crucial in that even if you were the innocent party, as an elder, do you want to do something that God hates?
Yeah.
Even if you were the innocent party.
Yeah.
To me,
And-
it seems disqualifying.
Yeah, and really and truly, personally, I'm trying to throw this out because this is the different views. Personally, I believe more along that line. Because is there really totally, yes, one person's committed adultery, but is there really totally an innocent party, or is there something that happened in the marriage? But this, what I think the article is trying to say is these are the three different things that people look at. Some congregations may say we have no problem with that, but other congregations do say, okay, yes, we recognize he's a great godly man and he's met most of the other things, but we feel that this is not the quality and the qualification. One of the things I mentioned last week, this is not a person I could look at and say, I want to follow his example on marriage. And so the congregation say, we don't want that individual. Could he, technically, could he qualify as an elder? Technically, yes. But would the congregation want him as an elder? That would be the real question, I think, that would be brought up here.
I'm not even sure if technically you can. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah, well, technically, he meets the definition of husband, one wife, that's what I'm referring to.
Except
Yeah,
for the fact that he's
Yeah.
done something that
Yeah.
God hates,
Yeah.
even if he were the innocent party.
yeah.
Quote,
Yeah.
innocent party.
And like I said, I totally agree with where you're at, but I'm kind of the technicalities. Okay.
I would take that also if your wife has died.
Yeah,
You were actually more qualified to be an elder because you did have a family and you can also deal with grief also.
yeah. And we've got one of our elders there at Southwest, that's the same way. His wife died, her husband died, and they met, and, I mean, he's a very good elder, and very compassionate. He's one that does a lot of the benevolent work and everything else, okay? Joseph?
I was just gonna say, if he divorces for the sexual immorality, even God himself permitted it.
Yes,
So for us to try to overword what God's has already said okay to, I know he dislikes it, but there is incidences where the incident party cannot control what the other person does.
yeah,
And you see this in the military a lot. Men go off into war and the wives astray,
yeah,
you know. But aside from that, I've always had a problem with this because God has permitted it. Just like you were saying that if your spouse dies, that bond is broken.
yeah,
And that God here says, your wife's cheated on you, that bond is broken.
yeah.
Now you can take them back.
Yeah. Yeah, And what you're saying, I think that is one of the differences between, because when my wife died, I mean, there's no way of reconciling it. I couldn't bring her back out of the grave, there's no way. But in a situation where a wife commits sexual immorality, that can be reconciled. And so that might be, and I think that's one of the things, as you come back to the question of somebody who's been married and divorced, that some of us have, is why didn't he work to reconcile that? Why did he go ahead and divorce her anyways? Unless there was no way to possibly reconcile it. But
And I agree that, yeah, that person probably should have taken that role,
yeah,
but we can't use that as an argument to say, well, he can't be it because of it.
yeah, okay,
Well, Joseph was saying that God says it's okay as far as that's a reason for divorce, but is it okay for the elder?
Yeah.
Would be okay for a regular church member
yeah,
in God's sight, but for an elder,
yeah. Maybe a different way, I'll just phrase it for me, so to speak, a different way. As I'm looking at different people that are qualified, and here I see a man that has been divorced and remarried, my question would be, if he is an elder, or if he is chosen and he becomes one of the elders, would I feel comfortable going to him if my wife and I were having marital problems? And if not, maybe that tells me something. And that's not, we're not really, we got the technicality, but we're dealing with the actual, would I really feel comfortable asking advice from him as opposed to maybe another man that has remained faithful to his wife and they're still together after many, many years of, the ups and downs that you always have in marriage. Yeah, okay, Betty.
maybe this doesn't register with anybody else, but like Paul said, it was okay for him to eat meat, but he said, I'd rather not eat meat than cause somebody to stumble. So if an elder has been divorced, it kind of okays it for other people, if you know what I'm
Yeah, yeah.
getting at there.
Yeah.
And it might cause
The
a
example,
stumbling block.
and so, yeah. And that's why I think some of us lean towards, even if they are divorced, they can do great work.
Yeah.
That's not saying they're worthless. There's great works they can do. There's great work I can do, even though I've lost my spouse. I'm handicapped. There's a lot of things I can't do that we can do together, but I can still, like I'm up here helping. I can still do a great work. It's just that there are certain things I can no longer do. Okay.
I think that we would all agree it's probably ideal for someone to become a Christian at a younger age, at the age when they become accountable. But I don't think anyone would question someone becoming a Christian at the age of 30 and or 35 and then being eligible for an elder when they're 70. So I'm not sure that the idealness of the whole life situation of someone is really what we should be qualifying someone as. It's more of the situation at hand, and if they are in a place that checks off the qualifications of the elder, and which includes more so the place in life where they are as well. So that being said, it's like if someone is qualified by this list, should we be questioning the idealness of their 20s or their teens,
Okay. Well, it's, every man has gonna have things in his life, but how did he overcome those? And, but as we come to the I'm gonna use the term must be again, at this point in his life, this is what he must be like. This is what we must be looking at. Okay.
Couple things said about divorce. I've been divorced, and it is painful. It is a ripping.
Yeah.
Lots of forgiveness was given, only to be dumped on again. And when I talk to people that are considering it, I encourage them to fight every fiber in their body to save the marriage, to save that.
Yeah.
it's made me wiser. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So, would you be able to go to an elder who's been through that? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because he knows the pain, he knows, you know,
Yeah.
why God hates it.
yeah,
But if you can't save it, you can't change somebody, you know, and make them obey you or make them, you know, be a good husband or whatever.
yeah.
Um,
And I think we all understand that.
Yeah.
It's just different congregations, you know, technically, are they qualified
yeah,
by the term husband and one wife?
mhm,
You know, yes, they would be qualified.
yeah.
The question is, would they be something I'd be comfortable with? Maybe he doesn't become an elder, but he may become a person, like you said, that in the congregation, people that have gone through divorce, they can go to him and say, how do I put my life back together again? How did you do it? But they can still be of definite benefit, but just not in the aspect of the eldership as it's used, or Paul used it here. Timothy.
So you've said it multiple times, and I think it's been said other times too, but the example, if a man is an elder, he is that example for the rest of the flock. So I'm just using this as an example as well. So if he's been divorced like 5 times, and say they were all scriptural divorces,
There's a problem.
well, there's a problem, yes, but I'm just
And
using,
he-
so the example is if they were all
That's
scriptural
a different,
divorces.
yeah.
But then you're like, oh, if he wants to be an elder, what's that set for example for the rest of the flock? I mean, that's really the idea here is,
Yeah.
he's supposed to be an example for the flock, and if he's
Yeah.
guarding the flock, he should be able to be, you know, that example in all aspects of his life.
Yeah. Other questions before we move on to the next big one? There's 2 big ones here.
More big ones.
Yeah. Okay.
So could you say that for a lot of different things? Like, what if he was a drunkard before, and then he
Yeah.
got out of that? And could he become an elder if he got baptized and forgiven all that? Because he was a drunkard before that, if he's leading as an example, does that disqualify him?
I know.
Under the technical thing, it would.
Yeah. And I've I've known elders that have done all sorts of
Sin to
things,
be an elder.
you know, in the past, and they have changed their lives, and that's why he's saying, what is their life like now?
Exactly.
I may have cursed a blue streak. You know, I may have grown up with sailors, or I may have been in the military and learned from the sailors how to curse like a sailor. But I have changed that. I have controlled my life, and I'm not that person anymore. You know, and that's the change, and that's what we're looking at. Here's a man who now is this way. I want to be like him. He had the problems I have. Maybe he had problems with his tongue. He had problems with jealousy. He had problems maybe with even looking at women and, you know, lusting after them. How did you overcome that?
Exactly, and that's why if he gets divorced for scriptural reasons, why is that not looked at as the same?
Okay. I guess because technically Jesus said it's not a sin, you know. And, but I know what you're referring to. Scott and then Rich. I don't know. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna put a nameplate right here. I think when you're talking about a man that's gonna oversee things,
Yeah.
spiritual, the lives of the spiritual lives of the flock, what we're looking for is a man that has spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
He's developed, he's grown.
Yeah.
And become more Christ-like than he was when he was younger.
And we'll see that on the next set of qualifications too. Okay.
I wanted to ask, when you guys say scriptural divorce, are you saying the divorces Jesus described where he said, like, if the woman strays, then the divorce is fine? Otherwise, there is no divorce, right? You're always
Yeah.
married.
Yeah, the only one that
When you say scriptural
Jesus,
divorce, is that what you're talking about?
yeah, Matthew 19, the only one that Jesus really said, okay, a person is free to remarry if their spouse commits sexual immorality. But the other question is, also, if they're Christians, shouldn't they be working to try to work that out? And instead, you know, because we've done a lot worse to Christ, and He's forgiven us. Okay.
And of course, God still hates that divorce. There's no divorce
Yes.
that God doesn't hate.
Yeah.
But I think the reason he allowed that scriptural divorce, Jeff, was that, I guess God wanted to say that he wanted his married people to have a right to divorce if it wasn't their fault necessarily that the spouse was unfaithful.
Yeah,
So they don't have to deal with that.
Right.
yeah. Okay, let's go into the next one. Next big issue. And so we may not get very far today. But the next one, let's turn to 1 Timothy 3, verse 4 and 5, and then Titus, the second part of verse 6. 1 Timothy 3, 4 and 5, and then Titus the 1, verse 6, the final part of it. He says, he must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his own children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And then in Titus chapter 1, verse 6 is the latter part of the verse. Having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. 2 points here. First of all, the elder is one who must have children. And Paul used in both places the plural. Not child, but children. Paul specifically used plural. Now I realize there's some who talk and say, well, Paul does use the kind of the plural to include the singular in some passages, like Ephesians the 6th chapter, verse 1, 1 Timothy 4 or 5, verse 4, verse 8, and then Titus chapter 2, verse 7, verse 11. But I personally think he's talking about the elder must have more than one child. Again, going back to kind of practical. In most families, in a situation, if you have just one child, how much problem do you have between the children? You may have a problem with child, but how much problem do you have with children fighting with one another, squabbling with one another, and having to work out all those different problems? You don't have it. But if you got more than one child, those of you that have children, what do you know happens all the time? He did it, she did it, her dad or whatever, and you have to work out those situations and bring about some type of a unity, even though you may have to force them sometimes. Kiss your brother, hold your brother, or whatever. Back when we did finally, well, we didn't have seatbelts then. The kids had to sit on different sides of the car, and then the one that didn't act, we had three. One that didn't act too bad was sitting in the center. But
It's good practice.
yeah, and that's that practice, because sadly, in the church, we have some members that sometimes act like children.
Squabbling.
And squabbling and fighting.
Can we make Grayson sit over there?
He sat in my seat or whatever. Yeah. No. And if they've learned in the home how to deal with that proving ground, training ground, they'll be a lot better qualified to deal with it in the congregation. And that's one of the reasons why I think that it should be, more than one child. Some congregations will say one child's fine, and that's technically, you can go either way. Okay.
I think if you have one child, you get it figured out how to deal with them, and you think, okay, the second one I've got figured out. The second one comes and they're totally different, so you have a new set, completely new, and so you need more than one child to figure out the squabbles in the church.
Yes. And so, so I think really, as you're looking, you're probably wanting to look at that as well. On how have they dealt with their children in the situations, and we'll see this more in just a minute when he talks about children in subjection. But the second thing that comes here is the elder must have believing children. And a lot of questions come up here. Everyone agrees that the word believing means Christians. Children that have obeyed the gospel. And you know, as we look at his life, if he cannot raise his children in such a way that they are going to become Christians, how can we expect him with those pliable minds, if he can't do it with them, how can we expect him to be able to do that with adults that are not quite as pliable of a mind? That's one of the points that comes up here. Another question that has often been raised is, what if a man has 3 children and 2 of them are Christians, but 1 is not? Maybe they're too young or whatever. Is he qualified? He has believing children, but there's some of the children that are not Christians. Is he qualified or not qualified?
If they're baptized.
Well,
I think they're believing because they know who God is, but like that, they haven't reached that age of accountability yet. They're still not old enough to do that unless you're saying people have to be 8 years old to be baptized.
yeah.
There's others, Jesus wasn't baptized till what, he was 30? So his dad technically couldn't have been an elder in the church because he was the oldest.
Yeah.
But I think if you go to any kid that comes to church and has been in the church a long time, do you believe in God? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And so really they're believing, they just haven't taken that step of confirmation to be baptized.
Okay. The question. Okay, go ahead.
The King James Version says, having faithful children and not accused of riot or unruly.
Yeah. Yes, and I was going to come back to that in a minute. That they're in total subjection. That not only believing children; those are some other qualifications. Right now, I was dealing with the idea of believing children. Okay.
It's been taught here that they believe in their father.
Yes, and that's kind of an alternate. I read that on some of these as well. That's an alternate view. It's not believing in God. It's believing in their father. They have confidence in their father, and they listen to him, and they are obedient to him. That is kind of an alternate view, but not. I don't think that's what that Paul is talking about here. I think he's talking about the fact of they have to be people that have. He's raised them up, and they know that I need to become a Christian. They become a Christian.
I think there's a couple different ways of looking at this passage. I mean, I think a lot of people understand it as each and every one of his children should be believers.
Yeah.
But I would not accuse one of being a false teacher if they thought it just meant that he had 1 or 2 children, plural, that believe. So I'm wondering, Richard, what would you say the answer is? Does he mean all his children should be
Okay.
believers?
That's the question that comes up is if they're not all believing, is he qualified? Technically, if he has, let's say, 2 children and they're both Christians, technically he's qualified. But what if he has, he's qualified. But what if he has 3 children, 2 of them are believers, and 1 of them, I'm going to just say, is too young? Is he qualified? Technically, he is qualified. But a question comes up. What if that child never becomes a Christian? Or what if they become rebellious and say, I'm not even going to go to church with you anymore? Now what does the elder that you put in do?
Step
So
down.
I actually have that example in a church that I attended in my youth. We had an elder that had 2 baptized children and 1 who was younger, but as time went on, she never obeyed, and it kind of introduced some division in the church because many did not consider him to be a qualified elder. And that's something that we would have to be cognizant of, that you're just opening the door for controversy when you start compromising the qualifications or trying to stretch, to meet the goals that we have.
Yeah.
you have to be careful, and I'm not saying anybody's, you know, trying to skirt the law. I'm just saying, we just have to be very diligent and careful about how we interpret, what God's will is. And I think in that case, he was not qualified. She didn't obey. His children, if you wanna phrase it that way, his children were not faithful. Some of his children were
Yeah.
faithful, is how you would have to describe it.
Okay, Rich, then we'll come back. I'll get the right.
I would think that, you know, if you had one man that qualified as an elder in all aspects, and you had a man like this, he had 3 children, 2 of them were baptized, and one was not yet of the age of accountability, I would think he would still be qualified, but later, if that situation arises where he didn't, when he became of age accountability, he did, then I think that elder should step down.
Yeah.
Which means they all have to step down.
If they only have
If they only had.
2 elders or something,
Yeah, but I'm saying the third, if it was a third one.
yeah. But even if they have just 2 elders, which some congregations that's the case, the eldership would be dissolved, okay?
I was just thinking, like, one of the things to consider about what believing might mean is that when it says not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination, those 2 things, I was looking up those words, and every time they're used in the Bible, they're talking about very mature, sinful choices that an individual is making, not just like throwing a temper tantrum like a child
Yeah.
did. Like, this is something that the children are deliberately rebelling and choosing, they're capable of doing these things, if that makes sense. They're not
Yeah.
just, they're old enough to make these choices that they shouldn't be making.
Yeah, and in fact, let's just real quickly, we're running out of time, but let's hit this, since you brought it up. Having children in subjection, and 1 Timothy 3, the word means in subjection, obedient, or under his control. You know, if a man has children that rebel against his authority, then he lacks the power to lead. And then in Titus 1, you're reading about Titus, that he must not be accused of riot or unruly. The word literally means that he must not be undisciplined, rebellious, or disobedient. In other words, his children are well-behaved, respected. There's orderliness in his home. The children that are rebellious or unruly would make him unqualified. Even though they may have been believers, if they, are rebellious or whatever, then it would not qualify him because it shows that he does not have control of his house. Okay.
And, while they're living under his roof, he has to have absolute
Yeah.
obedience and control. Once they leave home, it's
Yeah.
kinda hard to be able to,
Yeah, and that becomes a different question with, is what happens if they leave home and they become, rebellious and so forth. We don't have control after they leave home,
Exactly.
but when they're in the home, and that's where the proving ground is. Okay, Jenny?
So if you can't say if they're in the house, like, I respect my father, but I'm not in submission to my father. I'm in submission to him.
Yeah, well, that's
And
what we're
so
talking about.
That's where that line
Yeah.
breaks,
Yeah.
of you can't hold my dad accountable for me and my brother, because we're already out of his roof.
Mhm.
And so even though we are faithful, he has no control of who we married or what we do.
Yeah.
So then, to me, that changes the meaning of children, because yes, I'm his child, but
Your wife.
I am a wife
Yeah.
now, and so.
Or even if you're a single woman out in the business world.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
yeah. When you leave the home, then yes, you respect your parents, but you're no longer under the authority. Some of you may have been raised and heard the same phrase I heard from my dad. When you put your feet under this table, you're going to do what I say. And as long as you're, in the home, when you're away from the home, then you have no control. Really, an illustration of that will be the elders in the congregation. The members of the congregation are under their oversight, but if they move away, let's say they move over to Seattle, are they over them any longer? Are they concerned about their spiritual welfare? Yes, but they're not over them any longer. And so that's kind of a loose way to put it.
But saying that is also, okay, you can control
Yeah.
But have you taught them anything? Have you trained them?
Yeah.
If they leave your house and go off in their wild, I
Yeah.
would say you did a terrible job.
Yeah,
They're not under your control, but you did a terrible job.
yeah.
So I don't think that person would be
Well,
qualified.
If,
Do you know what I'm saying?
yeah, I know what you're saying. We have no control over our children when they leave the home. But if we have a man, what you're using to illustrate, you have a man that all three of their kids grew up in the church and they were part of the youth group and everything else, but all three of them, when they left home, they also left the church. Then I think in a situation like that, I would probably question whether or not he would be the type of person I would want to have yet. But the point is, we don't have, once our children leave our home, we don't have control. We hope we can instill within them the right,
Right. To
I'm
love
trying,
the Lord, to
the
follow the
love
Lord.
for the Lord and so forth, but we can't control what happens.
Yeah, real quick, in a situation where they do leave home and later maybe, are out of duty or something like that, that would, the man is still his father, he needs to hold him accountable in terms of not acting like everything's okay with him being out of duty.
Yeah.
If he's saying, you need to get back, you need to repent, and they're not
Yeah.
having Thanksgiving together because the dad's holding them accountable.
Yeah. We're still, as parents, we're still concerned about our children.
Exactly.
Yeah. And as elders, even
But
when,
I would think he's
yeah.
still qualified
yeah,
because he's older.
even when a sheep wanders away as an elder, you're still concerned about them. You don't just say, oh, well, I got 99 others here, you know,
Yeah, right.
we're still meeting the budget, so it doesn't matter, you know. They're lost sheep, we're responsible. Okay, next week we'll look at, basically we'll start into all the ones that we know pretty much, they're just standard qualities of an elder, and we'll look at those real quick. I was hoping we'd get through eldership. I figured we probably would today. But next week we will get through it. Thank you.